Hi, my name is Victoria Findlay Wolfe. I am an author, I am a quilter, and a designer, and an artist. I try not to forget that. You might be familiar with me with my improvisational piecing that I do with my scraps. I love scraps. I don't like to throw anything out. So today I want to talk to you though, a little bit about modern traditionalism, taking a traditional block and throwing some improvisation into it. One of the ways that I like to work is I work quickly. I like to get my pieces cut out, I like to get them up on my design wall, and I want to spend all of my time creating on the design. I don't like to spend time working on something on paper because I find that if I'm looking at it, it's not going to look the same on my design wall as it does on paper. So my goal is to try to get you to loosen up, try some improvisation, and look at your fabrics in a new way to make some very interesting quilts that you might not have initially set out to make. So we're going to be looking at the traditional block called Rocking the House. This is a standard quilt block, and we can tell that by color placement that we can change the look of this block very, very easily. Here I'm dropping the color into the outside shape of the little house. This time I'm taking it and I'm bringing it into the white space. So sometimes looking at these shapes within the traditional block, it's kind of like coloring in a coloring book. Those books are very popular right now. What colors are you going to pick up, drop into those spaces, and tell your own color story? But one thing that we forget to do is that sometimes we can change the parts around and make something that looks almost completely different than what the initial block was meant to do. Now, when I talk about having a parts department, getting my pieces cut out and put on the design wall, and that I like to work quickly, one way that I like to work quickly is by using a die cutting machine. Now, die cutting and improv might not be the first thing that you think about when you're diving in to do some improvisational work, but let me show you how I use that. So I have some examples here on the table showing the sort of the traditional block that I have, but I start by taking one of those shapes and dropping in some random color. It's a little bit unexpected. Not a big change, but still making one change within a traditional block is going to start adding improvisation to your work. Now, as you start moving up the quilt, you start seeing that I've now pieced some pieces with some negative space. I'm using white as my background, and I might just be dropping in one extra little piece of color. When we get up to this point, we're seeing that I'm piecing and I'm getting even less color. So I'm starting to look at those shapes and breaking it down, that just because that one shape might be a traditional house shape, how am I going to fill that space with color? Let's look at the die cutting machine and see just how quickly we can turn a basic piece of fabric of one color and turn it into multiple colors to get us some interesting effects that are going to happen, but still by piecing a traditional block. So I can, on my die cutting machine, lay 8 layers of fabric on here, and I can instantly get a parts department. And by parts department, I mean I have spent very little time getting all of my pieces cut out. I like that. I don't like to spend all my time cutting if I like to work quickly. Many of us have probably done some improvisational scrap piecing and quilting. One other thing that we all have in our stash somewhere is leftover UFO blocks, leftover UFO quilt tops. All of these things are options for me, and I call them all made fabric. So just because there are seams already inside of our block doesn't mean that we can't cut it up and turn it into something fabulous. We are probably not the same quilter we were when we started. We may have made a quilt top and lost interest on it. We may have decided we didn't like the color palette anymore. Part of improvisation is working with taking risks, and this is a really fun way to take risk and work with whatever options you're going to get when you cut your pieces out. And again, it's about looking and it's not about thinking and planning it out in your head ahead of time. Okay, so let's look at this. So I've got one layer already laying on my die cut that'll give us our traditional pieces of cutting just one shape per color. But if I take one of my other blocks that already has seams, these were leftover pieces from another project that I have that I'm just really not that into. So what can I do with it? I'm going to look at the shapes on my machine. I'm going to lie my piece of fabric on top of there, remembering that if you can use 8 layers of fabric on here, that you have to count your seam allowances as well. So I'm going to lay my mat back on top of it. That accounts for about 4 layers of fabric right there. I'm going to run this through my machine. and see what I'm going to get on the other side. Now, when I talk about risk-taking, I like to say that there are no mistakes in quilting. I like to make a bunch of pieces and then see what am I going to do with it. So there's no mistakes. It's now, what do I have? What can I add to it? What can I change? And what else do I need? So here you can see that I've cut my standard shape. And now I have a piece that already has 3 pieces of color filled into that one shape. There's my coloring. I've never been good at coloring within the lines. So that's one piece ready to go. And now I have some extra pieces already cut. Now I'm going to play with those parts and decide, where's my quilt top going to go? Where's my block? What is my block going to look like? I have some other pieces lying here that I've already cut that I can use. So there I have one piece that has some yellow, blue, and purple in it. These have some other random colors, and maybe I just want to use one of my solid pieces. Not being afraid to make a mistake is a great way to get you outside of the box. First of all, it's your fabric. You paid for it. You can cut it, you can change it, you can do whatever you want. And if you've already made that quilt top that you've lost your interest on, you're not going to lose anything. This is an opportunity for you to go, okay, so what can I do to that? What can I bring to the table to make that piece jump, be fabulous? Sometimes it's just taking a chance to cut it apart and look at it in a different light. Just because it was called a rocking the house block doesn't mean it has to end up looking like that. So what I like about dropping in that little bit of white space on my blocks when I'm cutting them out is it's giving me a space to look at negative space. So I have my basic colors. I have some random other colors here that I could drop into my block. I can play with the color placement. I tend not to overthink these. I like to get my pieces down, and then I'm going to look at how am I piecing it. Let's drop that piece in there. So now I can start to look at it, and I can look at color placement and layout. So when I'm doing this, I'm doing baby steps. So I've used my scraps. I've made a piece of fabric. Now I'm going to cut it apart. Now I'm going to start making segments and seeing what am I going to do with it next. I'm not thinking about the bigger picture, but I'm adding baby steps along my process to see what kind of an interesting block that I'm going to get. So if I'm happy with this visually, then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sew that block, and then I'm going to go ahead and keep making more blocks, and then at that time is when I'm going to put those on the design wall and figure out the placement and decide, do I want to add more white into the block? Do I need to take more color out of the block? I'm looking for my color story and watching the fabrics, how I'm cutting them to see where is it going? What can I do with it now? You'll notice on this quilt top also that sometimes I am still piecing the whole block in white, but instead of allowing the color to make sense, I'm looking for the lines of my piecing to still make sense. So even though there's not color happening in there, the lines in the piecing is actually taking up and giving information within that space. So it's even looking at how the stitching lines are going to help tell the story that you want to tell. Okay? So what I love about my die cutting machine though, is you'll notice on these pieces that the dog ears on the corners are already cut off, which means when I'm sewing these together, we have ease of piecing because everything lines up exactly where it needs to be. So now I'm going to be able to just sew my 1/4 inch, get these pieces sewn together, and I very quickly have a block. Okay? Let's take this to the sewing machine and get this block together. Because my dog ears are already cut, I know exactly where I'm going to line up. My 1/4 inch is already set, and I can quickly get this sewn together. Just going to continue to chain piece these. I'm going to go to the other side. I also like to use a very nice tight stitch length, so my threads aren't going to show at the top of my quilt top. Just a little extra detail. Okay. The two side sections are together. We're going to put this little square in the inside. Okay, so I've made my sections. The inside of the block, I would give these a nice good press. Right now I'm just pressing my seam allowances. I'm going to press these to the inside. The outside ones are going to go to the outside. Okay. When I'm pinning my sections, just out of habit, I pin at 1/4 inch through the first seam, and then I pin 1/4 inch through the second seam. This just saves me time as long as I do it the same way every single time that I'm pinning, because I know my seams are then going to line up exactly where I'm putting that pin, where it needs to live. This just saves me more time, so I can spend more time on the design wall instead of spending time with my seam ripper. Okay, so we're about out of time, but we would normally just finish this last seam, but let's come back up to the table and take a look. So you can see that just by using the die cutting machine gives you some very fun options for you to play with. Sometimes it's like a puzzle. You just want to cut your pieces, play with the pieces that you have, and have some fun playing with improvisational quilting.